how is it that I've recorded almost 3 seasons of this show, and as a worship pastor, I have not once talked about worship? Well, truthfully, it's not what the podcast is for, and I don't want to make it a platform about, oh, look at what I can do. But today's that episode. I'm going to talk about worship. Well, hey everyone, my name is Andrew Geist. Thank you for joining me on today's podcast episode of Anything Goes, A Journey Home, where I talk about worship and what I do. It's an incredible thing doing worship. I love it. I've been doing it for 13 years, almost 14. Started in 2011 in a church in Boynton Park, California, and a lovely senior pastor and his wife trusted me with their church and their worship team, and I made a ton of mistakes, but I learned a lot. I also learned what I wouldn't do going forward. After those 5 years were up, I transitioned to a church in Fresno, California, of about 600 people every Sunday. And the truth is, I learned a lot there as well. I was able to oversee a choir and an orchestra, and I was able to then transition into leading more contemporary styles, as well as overseeing an entire worship department for about 2 years. Again, I learned a lot, and then I transitioned to the church that I'm at now, which is averaging about 1,000 people every Sunday, which, again, is a truly incredible journey to have been on. The reality is that in worship ministry and church ministry in general, it is really hard to let something go that you've worked on for 6 years, or 7 years, or 8 years, or 13, or 25, or 15 years and built. I heard it once said by a senior pastor who's about 60 years old that he would never give the keys to his ministry, as it were, that he's worked on over the last 20 to 30 years to a 30-something-year-old pastor. And of course, he said this in jest because he was actually being critical of church culture not being really great at handling transitions. Now, for those of you in the corporate world or who work in any kind of business industry, this kind of sounds strange to you, but also might not be that strange because I think every organization and field that we work in, this becomes kind of a thing across all platforms. Think of small businesses who build and grow until eventually they become the Walmarts or the Targets of the world. And eventually they have to sell the thing that they've worked on most of their life to some big conglomeration and hope that they hold to the same values, which, if we're being honest, watching businesses like that grow and boom, they do eventually wind up giving up on their morals and their convictions about things and doing business well and become more focused on building finance. But the church also struggles with this. Senior pastors struggle to trust executive pastors. They struggle to trust worship pastors. Why? Because in many respects, part of their kingdom, and I use that word in a very loose term and a very tongue-in-cheek kind of manner, to indicate that they're sharing the responsibility and the burden of Sunday morning and what is presented on Sunday morning with an executive pastor or a worship pastor or a youth pastor and the kind to make for a whole experience for the congregation to have and hopefully facilitating encounters with God that are profound, real, and life-changing. But as we share those things, it can be hard for us to let go of the things that we've built. Trust me. As I worked with the choir that I was with at the last church I was in, I unfortunately had to be the one responsible for shutting that choir down. That choir had been around since the foundation of that church. You can imagine how much of a bad guy I was at that time. And in the same breath, I had to also help facilitate a church that, frankly, was, for lack of a better word, a house divided against itself, and bridging the gap between worship cultures that other people had not been able to successfully do, i.e., giving older generation of people an exposure to what was happening in contemporary music while also showing more younger people and exposing them to older music in worship. This was a challenging experience, but working on that whole experience was difficult to let go of when I was transitioned out of my position. In the same breath, the same can be true of pastors. When a pastor has built up a church for 13 to 25 years, and along comes a young 30 something upstart pastor who's passionate and driven and has new ideas and fresh creative ways to do these things and is super connected into social media and things like that, that can definitely impact one's self confidence and undermine a person's sense of self worth because maybe the ideas that they have right now aren't working and perhaps even feel like they're reaching for something or can feel like they're trying to sell you on something, which as gospel preachers, we don't really want to feel like we're selling you Jesus. We really don't need to. Jesus is a free gift. He's an amazing life to observe through scripture, in which he is the exemplification of righteousness and especially the imputed righteousness of his sacrifice onto our lives, really doesn't need our help moving him forward or his kingdom. But the reality is that he chooses us to be a part of it. And I think that's where we kind of start to lose and allow our selfish motives and our prideful motives, and truthfully, what has been humans' entire struggle, pride wise, with trying to just be in control, trying to make it ours, to, as I said, kind of declare like the church is our kingdom. The truth is, as a worship pastor, I can tell you right now, the church I'm at now, it doesn't belong to me, it belongs to God. The church I was at before, it wasn't my church. It wasn't even the senior pastor church or the elders church. It's God's church. And the church before that in LA was not my church, not that pastor's church, nor is it anybody in that congregation's church. It's God's church. And he's called every single person to each one of these churches for a purpose, a time, and frankly, as hard as it is for us to embrace sometimes, a season. Nevertheless, I love worship leading. And there are a lot of things that I've learned over the course of my seasons in worship leading. And I'd like to share those with you in today's episode. So, as I've said, I'm a worship pastor, and I've been a worship pastor for 13 years. One of the things I learned early on in my career as a worship pastor was you have to take ownership, and you have to be responsible, and you have to be reliable. No way around it. You can't be lazy. You can't make decisions on the fly. It doesn't make for a really trustworthy individual when you act that way. And I say that because in my early years, that's what I did. I did that a lot, probably more than I should have. I wasn't always prepared. I would rely solely on my talent and my gifting, perhaps in singing or playing my instrument. And I truthfully didn't really know the importance of what it was I was doing and leading in that moment every Sunday morning. Now, I know that might be hard to hear, but the reality is that when we're called into ministry, a lot of times we don't know those things because we haven't been taught them. We haven't been educated by them. And I recently come across posts that have actually encouraged me to really consider my responsibilities even more on Sunday mornings and throughout the week in how I equip and prepare people and even train people within these four walls so as they could, whether serve here in this church or serve elsewhere in the world and make Christ known in their own way. For example, teaching musicians who don't know how to read music, teaching them how to read music is a vital tool that they may not realize that they need, and how much more effective it will make them as musicians, whether in the church or outside the church, at communicating with other musicians in professional contexts, and then also providing means for them to share the gospel with those in an industry that frankly needs to hear about Jesus. Another thing that I learned early on in my worship ministry is how important it is to create space for oneself, to protect yourself, and how to trust people. A few years ago in my last church, I learned that the hard way. I trusted people that I thought I could trust with information that wound up biting me really hard. I also trusted leadership that I thought had my back, and they didn't. I also thought that I was doing a godly and righteous thing by standing up for what I believed in, when in reality, from one side's perspective, I was being completely and utterly disobedient. Now, I see both sides of the argument, and I definitely understand where these people were coming from, and I certainly understand why, for lack of a better word, trust was broken on all fronts. And as I said in a previous episode, the whole situation, every person from top to bottom of that whole situation from my last church in which I had to resign failed, including myself. And that's all that needs to be said about it. But I learned in that season how important it is to protect oneself, to care for one's soul, how to be connected with God, and how important it is to facilitate that relationship, but then also being intentional about what relationships I have in my life, both in church, outside of church, and over the internet and social media and things like that. And that was a difficult lesson to learn. And now, where I am now, I've learned the importance and value of excellence in what we do each week. As I've said in previous episodes, and perhaps I haven't, the reality is that if you're a worship pastor and what you do every Sunday morning matters for one reason and one reason only, you have a single opportunity to share the gospel with somebody that Sunday morning. And that message is eternal. And if it's missed, there are eternal consequences with that. Nobody likes the idea as Christians to think about going to heaven and having Jesus stand before us and asking, so what did you do with the message that I gave you? And our answer is, I sang songs on Sunday. Certainly, that has value. Certainly, it contributes, but it's just a part. But the reality is that if we don't do it well, and if we don't do it to the very best of our ability, and we walk away saying, I gave my very best to this because of the eternal consequences of sharing the gospel in this moment. And the truth is, on Sunday mornings, maybe the burden doesn't always fall to you to share those messages. That's what your partnership with your senior pastor is all about, or your discipleship pastor, or your missions pastor. Each member of your team exists to facilitate that message to varying ages and cultures and ethnicities for a reason. It doesn't solely fall on you. And that's the important part for us to understand, is that in doing stuff with excellence, we do it with the understanding that we don't want to shortchange God and his message. That's why when we do what we do on Sunday morning, we do it to the very best of our ability. And we walk away saying that we have done our very best. Now, that's not always clear. And that is also subject to the observer and the person who's giving the effort. From an outside perspective, some might view some Sundays as not my best effort. For me, if they have a conversation with me, might realize, oh, Andrew's kids were sick this week. Andrew's wife was sick this week. Or they are in a financial pickle this week, for whatever the reason might be. And this was Andrew's best for this moment. And that's the reality of subjectiveness when it comes to giving your best. Now, there will be people in your voice or in your head who are going to be telling you, is that really your best? I know you had a hard week, but could you have still given more? And I think that's the part that's really been resonating with me more recently, is asking and evaluating whether or not regardless of the circumstances in my life, for me personally, could I have given more? If the answer is yes, then my best was not actually present that day or that week. If no, then I can have peace and recognize that I did give my best. And it doesn't really matter if the person doesn't agree with me. I know that I gave my best for this particular season and being okay with that and being able to defend yourself and say, yeah, that was my best. I understand that perhaps it may not have been your best, but this is the season of life that I'm in. As we grow as worship leaders, you'll start to realize, holy moly, I have more capacity. Yeah, my wife is sick, my kids are sick, or yeah, we're having this financial difficulty. Yes, our car broke down, or yes, this family member passed away, or yes, this happened. All these things were true in my life this year. And there were moments where I didn't feel like I had the capacity. And so I gave my very best for what I had. But there were voices in my life who also said, I believe you have the capacity. I believe God is going to turn a corner in your life and give you the capacity that you need to, even though you have these struggles, you can give your very best in this situation. And it happened. I just came out of an incredible weekend of Christmas services. We had 4 services on Saturday and a 5th one on Sunday, and they were amazing. And part of why I know they were amazing was because I gave my very best to the effort of planning, preparing, and equipping the people on my team, as well as those who are in partnership with me, to make these services the best that they can be. Now, I want to share a couple of books with you that have changed my life and have been important factors in my worship leading experience, as well as just defining my own convictions about what is worship, what does worship look like, how does it function, what are the critical components of giving our very best, as well as just constantly being challenged to evaluate my personal opinions, thoughts, convictions about worship as I come across people. So the first book that really changed my life was a book by Bob Kauflin called Worship Matters. This book was my early introduction into worship. And I think this was a book that was a great place to start as a worship leader. If you haven't bought this book and read it, I highly encourage you to do it. On top of that, if you're a pastor, senior pastor, executive pastor, any kind of pastor who has, by their definition, no musical talent, but just the call of God in their life to preach God's word, I'm going to tell you right now, that book, Worship Matters, is for you too. You need to read it because you need to understand how a worship leader's mind works. There's kind of a misconception by most senior pastors, and I think it comes from just general hurt feelings between worship leaders and pastors, in this belief that that one of them is more creative than the other. The reality is that's just not true. God created us inherently to create because he created us. Like, think about that. God created us. And then he instilled in each of us the ability to create. Look at the world around us. The computer by which I'm even making this podcast was created by human beings, both male and female. And worship pastors and senior pastors do not have an exclusive corner of the market as far as creativity goes. It's just the creativity might look different. And the reality is that worship leaders and senior pastors need to get better in general at communicating with each other, period. They need to start understanding that their disagreements about whether or not to do a song may have nothing to do with creativity and everything to do with theology. And some senior pastors and worship leaders need to realize that some of their conflicts over volume and or the presentation of music also doesn't have anything to do with the musicianship and or the experience. It has everything to do with creating a space that is perhaps distraction free and devoid of opportunity to cause someone to withhold their praise, which we are commanded to do, sing praises to the Lord, that causes them to not sing praises on Sunday morning. That's perhaps a conversation that needs to be had. But we have to have those open and honest dialogues. And that book, Worship Matters, is one incredible book in which Both senior pastors and worship leaders will be informed of each other and be equipped with adequate vocabulary on how to communicate with each other. Now, Bob Coughlin wrote a follow up book to that, which is called True Worshipers. I read this a couple of years later, and actually during my time in the last church that I was in. And this book is an incredible journey through the woman at the well. And it is awesome. It reminds me that it's not about the high places, it is not about the low places. It is about the journey that we are on as worshipers and how important it is for us to worship in spirit and truth. I highly recommend that book for you to read. Now, for those of you just in general, in my general audience, know that I have gone through stuff by Cagel Spurts. And one of the things that they have created is this beautiful magazine collection called Cultivate. Now, this has been my devotional series off and on for a better part of 7 years. And I have to take this with a grain of salt because a lot of the ideas in here are very abstract, very creative, and they cause me to think about God in new and different ways and approach God in new and different ways, in ways that I wouldn't otherwise approach God. There's an element of engaging with one's emotions, engaging with other creative mediums than what I do, which is singing and playing piano and guitar. In these devotionals, they actually encourage us to think about God during things like winter seasons, or thinking about when new life comes into our world around us and how we can experience God just in nature or experience God in crafting things like pottery or creating artworks or things of that nature. And some of this stuff can be very thought provoking. And again, it is important because God created the emotions that we have, and it's important for us to balance our lives out and not simply be able to know God up here, but to be able to take that knowledge we have and have it mean something and feel something here. I've shared this many times with people. In worship leading, much like being senior pastors, I don't envy either of us our position. Here's why I don't envy senior pastors their position. Senior pastors are having to come up with, in this day and age, a new and exciting way to share the gospel that Jesus Christ shared 1,000 years ago plus. And truthfully, there have been hundreds, if not thousands, of men of God who've come before them sharing that exact same message in some new and exciting way, all in which to engage somebody and hopefully help somebody to, again, find Jesus and have a relationship with him. And then on top of all of that, they need to present it in a way that is modern. They need to present it in a way that makes sense with today's culture, while at the same time not sacrificing to culture Jesus' message. That is a difficult place to be. In the same breath, as a worship pastor, I can never make anyone in the room happy. There will always be somebody who will be disappointed. Why? Well, because music is both emotional and subjective. There's a whole generation of singers, songwriters, and Christians who've given their lives to Christ thanks to the song Amazing Grace. There's also a whole generation of people who've given their lives to Christ because of a song like Reckless Love, or What a Beautiful Name, or Great is the Lord by Michael W. Smith. Those experiences are tied not just to the music, but to where that person was in that moment emotionally. And those ties are strong. That's honestly why I'm the person who gets asked, so when are we going to do this song? The most. Now, I'm not complaining. I love those comments. I really do, because it informs me about what the culture I'm serving is listening to on a regular basis, or what they're most influenced by, what part of God's grace in song form, or what part of God's love really is resonating with them. I love hearing about these stories, and I love interacting with congregations about these things. So don't ever stop to think, oh, Andrew doesn't want to hear about this song. I would love to hear about those songs. Can I promise that I would do them every Sunday? No, I wish I could. But the reality is I still love hearing about them because those are your journeys And those are the way that God is speaking to you through those songs and those experiences that you have. And I love hearing those things. But for that very reason, that's why the job is so difficult. You have a audience of people of different ages, ethnicities, demographics, cultures, and upbringings with all of those independent, unique ideas and unique experiences with music and worship and giving their lives to Christ that are their own. And here is this one guy up here trying to find the exact songs that will fit to make it to where all of us realize that we're all in this together. We are a family of God here to do one thing: worship God. It's a tough place to be. And as I said, every Sunday morning, there's always somebody who's a little disappointed that I didn't do a song that they would have liked to hear. And I get it. It's hard. It is. Some other books that I found very useful in my worship career, and I encourage especially you young worship leaders to really embrace these kinds of literature in your lives and use these tools, is these wonderful books called Hymn Stories 101. And usually there's like 101. There are a lot more out there. I strongly encourage you to find books like this for your worship leading. You're going to eventually come across a day where you have no choice and the senior pastor is asked, I really would love for you to do this hymn. And you've never done a hymn. And you don't even like hymns. You don't see the value of it. Well, the reality is like I said, there's a whole generation of people who gave their lives to Christ because of those songs. And you cannot say no to a song simply because you don't like it. And realizing that those songs that you're doing are actually encouraging people who need to hear that song again and remind them that God still loves them, that their lives still do matter to God. Because in the church, there's a whole generation of people that do, both on both sides of the spectrum, old and young, feel like they're left out, feel like they're neglected, feel like nobody cares about them. And these wonderful books tell the story about how these songs were written. And you might just find it incredible for yourself to hear the amazing stories of these hymn writers who had similar testimonies to ours. There are men who lost everything. They lost their jobs, their homes, their children, and yet still wrote songs like "It Is Well With My Soul." There are men who dabbled in slave trade, physical abuse of humans, utter disregard for human life, and they wrote incredible hymns describing the grace of God that was imputed to them and given to them freely. These books will help inform you, if for nothing else than to help you appreciate why these songs matter to a whole generation of people. But then on top of that, also providing you creative segues by which you can creatively orchestrate and connect contemporary arrangements to hymn arrangements, and thereby bridging a gap between generations of worship that, frankly, has been going on for quite some time, a generational war, if you will, of worship. Which worship is better, hymns or contemporary music? And the truth is there are a generation of songwriters that are out there, whether it's Sovereign Grace or City of Light, that are writing songs that are contemporary hymns. Keith Getty is one of those people who also writes hymns that are more modern and more contemporary. Nevertheless, books like this have been incredible for my journey and have been absolutely indispensable to me as tools to crafting the services that I've been able to lead. Now, there will be seasons in your life where none of these books will be relevant to you. There will be seasons where you may not touch these books for what seems like months, and that's okay. Right now, I'm in a season where I haven't really touched a lot of the books regarding hymns because I'm in a more contemporary culture of worship, and that's fine. There's going to be a season where I may need to go into those books more. There's been a season where I haven't had to read Bob Coughlin's Worship Matters book or True Worshipers, or there's been months, even weeks between sessions of reading Cultivate because some of those things can be very difficult to digest. especially if the concept of dealing with your emotions is something that you don't particularly like to deal with. But I think we all need to. Nevertheless, these are the things that over the course of my career as a worship pastor that have helped me. On top of all those things, don't be afraid to learn. Don't be afraid to learn a new instrument. Don't be afraid to pick up that guitar if you've only ever played piano. Don't be afraid to pick up the piano a little bit and learn how to play the piano if you've only ever played guitar. Learn what it means to manage people and to lead confidently, to not be afraid of speaking the truth in love and letting people know that, don't worry, I got this. And allowing yourself to be the person to mitigate conflict, to mitigate issues during things like rehearsal or preparation for Sunday. And also, don't be afraid to pick up things, especially if you're a worship leader, to pick up things in the tech world. Learn what ProPresenter does and how it works. The reality is that I think in church culture, a byproduct of what I talked about earlier in the episode is that we tend to become islands unto ourselves. We tend to believe that this is mine, I'm responsible for it, and nobody else can do it. Because if somebody else is responsible for it, then that means I have no value to add to this situation. Well, that kind of doesn't make sense if God has called us into this ministry. The reality is your value is not dependent on what you know and how much you can do in your church body. It's dependent on how much you're willing to contribute and your willingness to share those responsibilities with other people and allow them to get better at those things. I share responsibilities with my production director. I share responsibilities with my creative director. I share responsibilities with my communications manager because there are things that I am frankly not that good at, but I help each and every one of them on my team to varying degrees as I'm able. And I think that's an invaluable tool as a worship leader to have, is a willingness to do any of those things. In the same breath, I hope one day to be able to share with my senior pastor, to be able to share responsibilities with my senior pastor that he would have. Maybe that's setting up something in the lobby, or perhaps it's sharing a message on a Bible study weekend, or sharing a message on a Sunday morning if he should trust me with those kinds of things. But I want to reach that point, and that's the level of learning and the willingness to work hard and not believe that your island is only music and crafting the most perfect experience on Sunday morning for music and worship. Because the reality is, and this is what I've come to believe, worship is everything that we do in our lives that ascribes what is the most valuable and worthwhile thing in our life, and that is Jesus. So hopefully, whether you're serving as a worship pastor, youth pastor, senior pastor, missions director, children's ministry director, your entire life encompasses just that. You're ascribing worth, not because you are an expert at children's, but because you do all things well for the glorification of Jesus. So think about that as you're pursuing your call and serving ministry to the best of your ability on this journey called life. So I want you to do something today. I covered a lot of information and I talked a lot about worship leading. But maybe you're out there and you know me or you have questions for me. In the comment section below, ask me some questions about worship leading, what it's been like being a worship pastor. If you have questions about church hurt, feel free to throw those in the comments below. If you have questions about what it means to worship, where do I find books that you talked about? All those things. Put those in the comments below, and I would love to answer those questions for you and help you find the information that you need and hopefully give you answers that are thought-provoking and encouraging that help you feel connected to me and to this world, and hopefully a little bit more connected to your journey of life. Hey everyone, thanks for listening to today's episode of Anything Goes, A Journey Home. You can find me at aguysproduction.com. You can also find all the episodes for this show and previous seasons at ajourneyhome.blog. If you like this podcast, don't forget to subscribe, click the bell so that you get notifications every time I take a journey home. And Don't forget to use the social media links that are in the show notes below as well to connect and get updates. I post in there all the time reels from previous episodes and previous encounters that I've had with other podcasters, and I'm looking forward to adding more podcast episodes in which I get to interview people and interact with people who are also on this wonderful journey called life. Now, let's show faith, love, and hope to those who need it and be an encouragement to those who need it. Y'all take care. I'm going home.